Oh, hello there. Welcome to season 2 of Weekly Let. We've taken a little bit of time off. We're returning with Jack London, who I probably should have gotten to earlier or sooner, but we kind of do what we fancy at the time, and there's always plenty of authors to discuss and works, and so we'll get around we'll try to get around to as many as possible. But anyway, season 2, there's a little bit of a delay, which I apologize for. I could blame it on loss of a little bit of equipment, which did take place. I was spending a fair amount of time coaching young men in the art of football, which also took some time away from doing this. I had a vacation in there in the summer, and all those things contributed. But one of the main things was after the last episode that I did, I think this is episode 18, so after episode 17, as I recall, I trimmed my beard and the gauge slipped, gouged a little more than I wanted to, and had to trim it down very short. And I could come on Weekly Lit without a proper level of magnificence of beard. It's just not fair to the viewers. And so it took a little time, but we're back in what I like to call full splendor. In fact, maybe a little too much splendor. But nevertheless, here we are, and we're going to dive into Jack London. Jack London was the most, I think, probably the most popular writer of his time, and the work that he did really echoes throughout modern literature, even to this day. Still quite popular. Not as popular as he should be, but you could say that about a lot of classic authors. About literature in general, it's not as popular as it should be. That's why we're doing this. But anyway, with Jack London, I had quite an experience growing up, rough childhood in the San Francisco area, and quite a lot of adventures as a young man, including working on steamer ships, traveling the railways as a hobo, and really obviously introduced a lot of those themes and experiences into his writing, and wrote on what I consider a very human level. Yeah, in other words, you have to dig a little bit for the themes. The themes are very much the themes arise from his descriptions of nature, the wilderness, the relentlessness of the environment, and juxtaposed against man and man's position in and out of wilderness, and how quickly those circumstances can change. And really, not that long ago, he was writing the turn of the 20th century, and yet the wild was even wilder then, and less forgiving than maybe it is now, until we get out into the real wild, of course. But his stories, dealt with Northern California, Alaska, the Yukon, and they are cleanly written, well written, very descriptive. He obviously had a great influence on Ernest Hemingway and many other authors. His even today, in the last couple of years, we had a Disney movie about the Call of the Wild. A few years before that, on Netflix, there was a compilation of stories compiled as the Ballad of, I think it was Lester Scruggs. And as I was watching that, about halfway through one of the stories in the middle, I'm like, boy, this is a lot like a Jack London story. And then I realized, no, this is a Jack London story. About finding gold out in the or hiding gold in the wilderness, and finding it, and somebody else finding it. Anyway, great story, adapted to that. And So obviously, still, his work is still out there. I think probably everything he did is in the public domain. The ones that everybody should read as much as possible, especially young men. It's a great introduction into literature, but everybody should read The Call of the Wild, White Fang, To Start a Fire, or To Build a Fire, rather, and the great short stories, and has a wealth of works that I highly recommend. We'll get to an excerpt from To Build a Fire in a moment here, but I just want to, in case you're joining us for the first time, fill in what we're doing here. Weekly Lit is approximately weekly, when I get back to it, series where we'll just talk about literature, and I like to have a discussion, have it be two ways. If you make comments or send it to weeklylit@gmail.com, and I'd like it if you shared and subscribed and got the word out to sort of enlarge the discussion. You can send in questions or comments. I'll try to give a little bit of a preview of what we're going to do a little bit ahead of time. For instance, I think within the next episode or two, I'm going to cover Dune, because the film just came out, the newest film version, and so it's kind of timely to discuss that. So if you have thoughts or comments about Dune, you could email those in ahead of time, and let me know what you like, and if there's something you don't like, keep it to yourself, and but primarily, spread the word so we can get the word out about this, and share great works of literature. That's what this is all about. There's plenty of people trying to turn modern literature into just a checklist of representation, as particularly in young adult literature, and that's fine for what it is if that's what you're looking for, but there's so much more out there, including the classics, and so anyway, I have to include a story about a dog, first of all, because of Jack London's, again, Call of the Wild, White Fang, both fantastic dog stories. And we just put down Belle, a great golden retriever. So in honor of Belle, I'm going to read a little bit of an excerpt from I shouldn't say a little bit of an excerpt. I'm going to read an excerpt of To Build a Fire from the middle of the story, when the man who's out on the Yukon needs to build a fire, and because of the falling into an icy pond and getting wet, and then out of his own series of mistakes, although he couldn't have probably seen the frozen pond without noticing, that's not primarily his fault, other than venturing out in the first place. But anyway, he has a native dog following him and accompanying him, and then he starts to build a fire and does it under a tree, and the heat from the fire dumps an avalanche of snow onto the fire, puts it out. So anyway, he has these are all spoilers, but obviously still worth reading the story. But anyway, at this point, we're midway through the story, and it exemplifies the relentlessness of nature and man's place in it, and how man responds. And that's really the theme of To Build a Fire. So here we go with an excerpt. The sight of the dog put a wild idea into his head. He remembered the story of the man caught in a storm who killed an animal and sheltered himself inside the dead body, and thus was saved. He would kill the dog and bury his hands in the warm body until feeling returned to them, then he could build another fire. He spoke to the dog, calling it to him, but in his voice was a strange note of fear that frightened the animal. It had never known the man to speak in such a tone before. Something was wrong, and it sensed danger. It knew not what danger, but somewhere in its brain arose a fear of the man. It flattened its ears at the sound of the man's voice. Its uneasy movements and the liftings of its feet became more noticeable. But it would not come to the man. He sat down, got down on his hands and knees, and went toward the dog. But this unusual position again excited fear, and the animal moved away. The man sat in the snow for a moment and struggled for calmness. Then he put on his mittens, using his teeth, and then stood on his feet. He glanced down to assure himself that he really was standing, because the lack of feeling in his feet gave him no relation to the earth. His position, however, removed the fear from the dog's mind. When he commanded the dog with his usual voice, the dog obeyed and came to him. As it came within his reach, the man lost control. His arm stretched out to hold the dog, and he experienced real surprise when he discovered that his hands could not grasp. There was neither bend nor feeling in the fingers. He had forgotten for the moment that they were frozen, and that they were freezing more and more. All this happened quickly, and before the animal could escape, he encircled its body with his arms. He sat down in the snow and, in this fashion, held the dog while it barked and struggled. But it was all he could do, hold its body and encircle in his arms and sit there. He realized that he could not kill the dog. There was no way to do it. With his frozen hands, he could neither draw nor hold the knife, nor could he grasp the dog around the throat. He freed it, and it dashed wildly away, still barking. It stopped 40 feet away and observed him, curiously, with arms sharply bent forward. The man looked down at his hands to locate them and found them hanging on the ends of his arms. He thought it curious that it was necessary to use his eyes to discover where his hands were. He began waving his arms, beating the mittened hands against his sides. He did this for 5 minutes. His heart produced enough blood to stop his shaking, but no feeling was created in his hands. A certain fear of death came upon him. He realized that it was no longer a mere problem of freezing his fingers and toes, or of losing his hands and feet. Now it was a problem of life and death, with the circumstances against him. The fear made him lose control of himself, and he turned and ran along the creek, along the old trail. The dog joined him and followed closely behind. The man ran blindly in fear such as he had never known. Slowly, as he struggled through the snow, he began to see things again: the banks of the creek, the bare trees, and the sky. The running made him feel better. He did not shake anymore. Maybe if he continued to run, his feet would stop freezing. Maybe if he ran far enough, he would find the camp and the boys. Without doubt, he would lose some fingers and toes and some of his face. But the boys would take care of him and save the rest of him when he got there. And at the same time, there was another thought in his mind that said he would never get to the camp and the boys. It told him that it was too many miles away, that the freezing had too great a start, and that he would soon be dead. He pushed this thought to the back of his mind and refused to consider it. Sometimes it came forward and demanded to be heard, but he pushed it away and tried to think of other things. All right, so it goes on from there to a thrilling conclusion, but I'll leave for you to discover the rest of that, or to rediscover it if you've read it before. So that's it for this Weekly Lit. I hope to bring more episodes again on a weekly basis, along with some bonus episodes to make up for lost time. And so until next time, love to hear from you, and read harder.